This week's Dark Side of the Ring focused on the Sandman, who's looking and sounding a lot better these days than he used to. He's even got his own podcast now that he hosts with his two sons. The man who was drinking beers in ECW long before Steve Austin started doing it in WWE. This was the first, I would say, really ECW-centric episode since the New Jack one from Season 2. Not a lot of new information. I wouldn't say there's a lot of new ground covered here. Did not go very deep. But then again, maybe there just isn't anything all that deep about a guy who walked to the ring in sweatpants, smoking a cigarette, and drinking 6 beers. I did not follow ECW too closely when it was active. I mean, I knew about it. I knew the key players. I would flip it on occasionally at 3 o'clock in the morning on MSG Network after the latest Shannon Tweed movie ended on Cinemax. I never got the appeal of the Sandman until I saw that entrance. And once I saw the entrance, I got it. I understood. Once the bell rang, though, it was all over. That was a whole other story. The Sandman basically, like if ever there was a person in wrestling who was an entrance, it's the Sandman. And I will go on record right now that the greatest entrance that I have ever seen in all my years of being a wrestling fan, the greatest entrance of all time, and this is from someone who was not even a big ECW guy, is the Sandman at the first One Night Stand pay-per-view at the Hammerstein Ballroom. Fucking unbelievable. I will take that entrance in front of that crowd over most of the big elaborate productions that they do these days for some of these entrances. But they got into his drug use early on. He was all coked up when he was breaking into someone's house and he got arrested on a burglary charge. And he got in a fight when he was in jail with another inmate over the use of the television. Ended up accidentally punching a guard in the face when the guy ducked. It was like a wrestling match. The guy ducks and he punches the guard in the face. He's lucky they didn't ring him up on new charges, but they did throw him in the hole for 6 months. He tells the story of when he got out of jail. He ended up at a club and he's drinking and he's on the dance floor. He's dancing and he got pulled off the floor by some blonde that he thought he was going to have sex with. He's like, oh, okay, cool. Let's go find a place where we can, do the deal here. Turns out she was scouting him to be like a Chippendales stripper. And he did that for a year before he got fired for soliciting. Yes. Not only did Sandman work as a carpenter and a roofer early in his life, he was also a male prostitute. I did not have that on my bingo card. That is one new fact I learned that I was not aware of coming into this episode. So they interviewed his ex-wife, Lori, who was his valet at ECW. She went by the name Peaches. They had to rush to get married because she was pregnant, and he didn't want her to have the baby out of wedlock. How romantic. He was working in construction when a wrestling school opened up. It was run by Joel Goodhart. And Sandman was a wrestling fan from the time he was a wee little Sandman. So he was a wrestling fan through and through. And he looked into the school and he was wrestling within 6 months. Sabu mentioned that he first met Sandman when he started doing the surfer gimmick. If you have never seen the Sandman in his early days, the best way I could describe it is, he looked like a Wish version of Surfer Sting. He didn't have the face paint. He didn't have the physique like Sting did, but he had the bleach blonde hair, the wetsuit. He had an actual surfboard that he carried to the ring with him. And because he was a surfer, that's where the Sandman name came from. Actually, he was Mr. Sandman when he first started, but then they shortened it. Todd Gordon noted that the gimmick was garbage. Even his own daughter was mocking it in the episode, but Sandman was actually, you know what? He was not a bad worker back then. You watch footage of him, he was not a bad worker. He regressed as the years went on, but at the beginning, he looked pretty capable. Gordon gives Paul Heyman credit for all the negative things that Gordon has said about him, and there's a lot of heat there for a lot of different reasons. But he does give Paul credit when he brought him into ECW. He gives him credit for turning the promotion around. The first night that Heyman saw the surfboard, he told Sandman, that surfboard, it's getting broken over your head. And they had footage of it to show. Then Sandman, one day, he forgot his wrestling boots. He got to the building. He goes, I apologize, Paul. I forgot my wrestling boots. And Paul's like, I don't give a fuck if you wear wrestling boots. And it was like the light bulb went off. It was like his eureka moment in Sandman's head where he realized, I can just be myself. I don't have to wear trunks or tights or boots, put wrist tape on. That's where the classic sort of every man look for the Sandman was born. No tights, no trunks, no wetsuit, just sweatpants, a shirt, a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and a can of beer. And the Sandman was born. Or I should probably say reborn. They interviewed Raven, they interviewed RVD, Bill Alfonso. So at least they were able to get a good assortment of ECW faces to be part of this thing. RVD said that he always trusted Sandman, even though he was never sober in the ring. I think it was Mick Foley, I think, one day. He wrestled Sandman. And then he went to Paul Heyman. He told Paul, he goes, look, I can't work with this guy if he's going to be drunk like this all the time. And so Paul told him, hey, look, wait until after the match is over to indulge. And Sandman went out and he wrestled sober. And the match was fucking terrible. Just god-awful. And from that night on, they let him drink because he was actually a better worker drunk than he was when he was sober. Sandman told the story of the Singapore cane in the episode, which came from the story. Now, it made headlines around the world back in the 90s. I remember it. I couldn't remember the kid's name, but the kid's name was Michael Fay. He was an American teenager. He got busted in Singapore for vandalizing cars. I think he was stealing road signs and just doing stuff that he shouldn't have been doing. He was being a deviant. And he got sentenced to 6 lashes with a cane for violating their Vandalism Act. That was the punishment back then. And I think the two countries, they negotiated it down to 4 lashes. But he had to take his lashes. And it was Heyman's idea for him to start using a Singapore cane, which was a kendo stick, but to, play off the incident, that's what they called it. And that's what it was. To me, it was always the Singapore cane. This kendo stick nonsense didn't become a thing until, I don't know, in the last 20 years. But I always thought of it as the Singapore cane. And the way it came about, Heyman, he reached up, he's outside with Sandman. He rips a tree branch down and he hands it to him and he says, wrap this in tape and this is going to be your Singapore cane. And that led to the famous angle where Sandman caned Tommy Dreamer 10 times with Dreamer asking him, thank you, sir, may I have another? Right before the last lash. And you could see the bloody welts across Dreamer's back as the caning was going on each time. Like in between every lash, Woman was out there. Woman was with Sandman at the time. She was his valet. And in between every lash, she would tell him, Dreamer, all you have to do is get down on your knees and just kiss my feet. And Dreamer refused. He wanted to take his beating like a man. And from that night on, the innovator of violence was born. They made a star that night. He had earned the respect of the fans. Sandman's son, Tyler, if you were an ECW fan, you might remember his son. He was interviewed for this. He's not a little boy anymore. He's a grown-ass man, but that little boy from ECW, I'll tell you what, though, his acting chops were probably better than most. He talked about his dad becoming famous and the road schedule that he had. And yeah, he thought it was cool that his dad was a wrestler, but there were times where he wished that he would just have him at home. Heyman was the one who had the idea. Now, Heyman had claimed, I guess, that I got this idea. I'm going to have Macaulay Culkin play your son. He's talking to Sandman one day. And Sandman goes to him and goes, why not just use my son? He's outside in the van. And Heyman's like, all right, cool. We're going to use your son. Gordon says that was a lie. Paul had no connection to Macaulay Culkin, who was a big wrestling fan. I remember seeing him in the crowd. He was still a kid. I remember seeing him in the crowd in 91. That was WrestleMania 7. And it wasn't even like he was announced that he was there. They literally just had a crowd shot and it's like, oh, shit. They kind of zoomed in on him and there's Macaulay Culkin, who came to fame with the Home Alone movies. So Tyler says that he was 6 years old and his parents asked him at the time, you want to be part of the show? And his answer was, I guess. This kid's 6 years old. He doesn't know what he's getting himself into. It's fucking ECW, of all the promotions, no less, for him to get involved in. I used to have nightmares about that. I would see what they were doing to each other on that hardcore TV show at 3 a.m. And I would have nightmares. It scared me. Back then, I didn't want to go to the ECW arena. That was the last place I wanted to be. I'd rather be at one of these TV tapings and watch The Goon. Fucking TL Hopper. I didn't want to be around these fucking crazy people. So Raven, they did the angle. Raven turns Tyler against his father after he had already turned Sandman's wife against him. And Raven called their feud one of the greatest in the history of the business, but he admits that he may be biased because he was part of it. Maybe just a little bit. Lori isn't sure how it all started, says that they coached Tyler in the back, and Sandman told him, just make sure you don't smile. I don't want you to react. He wanted him to have like this stoic look on his face. Don't fucking smile when you go out there. And they dressed him up like Raven, and we got the clip of him saying, Daddy, you're a drunk, and now I worship Raven. And even the ECW crowd, they didn't really know how to react, right? There was no booing. There was no cheering. And Raven says, Tyler is an amazing actor. He never missed a spot. Raven said he would be drunk practicing promos, and he would screw them up, and the kid would always hit his lines. So Lori says it turned her life upside down because they had to leave in separate cars to keep kayfabe. They would meet up at gas stations to all get back together in the car and then go home. And, they have to make sure there were no fans around. And she said it just got to be too much and she couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't do it to her kids anymore. Raven talked about the idea of putting Sandman on a cross to feel his pain. And he says he knows he can't build a cross. And Sandman is like, I'll do it. Because as we learned earlier, he used to be in construction. That's what he used to do. He used to build things. So Sandman built his own cross. And they put a barbed wire crown on Sandman's head. They tied him to the cross. This was a very infamous angle in ECW. And it was too much even for their crowd. And like, even when they did the angle, you could look at the crowd and listen to the crowd. Even they were shocked. And it took a lot to shock that audience. And even they didn't know quite how to react to it. Sandman, of course, he thought it was great. And they show footage as the wrestlers are tying him to the cross. He said, Stevie Richards was saying to him, this is messed up, man. This is messed up. But they do the angle. And they get backstage. Sandman is just, this is so great. This was so great. He says everything was great except Kurt Angle had to be in the building that night. And indeed, Kurt Angle, a young Kurt Angle, fresh off of his Olympic win earlier that year, happened to be at the ECW arena or whatever building it was, but he happened to be at the arena that night. Now, Kurt has talked about this. He talked about it on his podcast a number of years ago. So what happened was he had been approached by Shane Douglas, fellow Pittsburgh native, about appearing in ECW. And he led Angle to believe that ECW was something other than what it really was. As Kurt described it, he said, we're good friends. Back then, he knew a friend of mine, got my number from a mutual friend. He called me and said, hey, we have this company that's more geared towards your type of wrestling, your Olympic wrestling than pro wrestling. It's called ECW. And he's telling me this looks more like Olympic wrestling than pro wrestling. I was like, so you're starting a pro amateur wrestling league? And he's like, no, it's pro wrestling, but it looks more like amateur wrestling. And that's why they apparently put the Taz match in there just to make him happy. Because Taz had a match on that show. Kurt said that him and Guido did amateur wrestling at the show that he went to. That's Taz and Guido. Shane asked me to be a part of it, and they were going to pay me a good amount of money. I was excited because I thought it was geared more towards amateur wrestling. When I got there, and I'm meeting the boys, they're all tattooed up with long hair, and they got their gear on their torn jeans. And Raven is holding a chair, and Sandman is holding a kendo stick, and someone else is holding a ladder. And I'm like, this is supposed to be amateur wrestling? This is worse than WWE. It was a very eye-opening experience to be a part of the show, and what happened during the show was crazy. You've got to understand that I am a Christian kid from Pittsburgh, and to see the crucifixion was really offensive. I do want to say this because I do want to get off my chest. I did not understand the storytelling of pro wrestling and how you want to get the wow factor. Surprise people, get them excited or get them pissed off. A lot of emotion is involved in pro wrestling and telling a story. I didn't get all that, and I didn't understand it. When I saw it, I was like, this is a crucifixion. It's someone portraying Jesus on a cross, and I can't believe I'm here. I was really upset. I went to Paul Heyman and I said, I can't be on the same show as this. You can't air this show with me on it, and if you do, you're going to hear from my attorney. Paul said, I didn't even know it was going to happen. And I was like, he's the promoter and it's the main event, and he doesn't know that this is going to happen? He's full of shit. I love Paul. He's a great guy, but he basically lied to me. Well, no, I wouldn't say he basically lied to you. He lied to you. You don't got to put the word basically in there. He said, I understand why. He was just trying to take the heat off of himself. I was serious. I told him, I'm going to sue you if I end up on the same show. I won that battle, but it definitely scared me away from pro wrestling. I was terrified. That was my last straw, and that was late 1996. That was my introduction to pro wrestling. It was overwhelming. Imagine that being your introduction to pro wrestling. It's no wonder that Kurt stayed away for 2 years before we saw. Actually, it was 3 years before he debuted in WWE. But I think it was around 98 that he finally, made the jump and said, hey, I want to do this. And WWE sent them basically to their developmental. So anyway, they quickly realized that night that they messed up, to the point where Paul Heyman sent Raven back out to the ring out of character to apologize to anybody that he may have offended for what happened. This is what Tommy Dreamer later said was the least sincere apology that he has ever heard. And they showed footage of it. Raven stands in the ring and he says, and they didn't show this whole thing, but what happened that night is he got in the ring and he said, apparently Todd Gordon and Paul Heyman, by acting without their knowledge, are offended by my use of religious iconography. And apparently I have offended quite a few people in the audience. Well, you people chose to respect Scott Levy's privacy when I needed personal time. And so I choose to respect your privacy and your religious beliefs. For the people I deeply offended, I apologize. And he put the microphone down and he walked out. Nothing like that had ever happened before or again in the history of ECW, where they broke the fourth wall, they broke kayfabe, they sent somebody out there to actually say, I'm sorry. Even they had boundaries that you could not cross, and they managed, no pun intended, they managed to cross that on that night. And he didn't want to do it, Raven didn't, because he felt ECW was the place where they pushed boundaries, and, to go out and apologize for what he did went against everything that they stood for. Sandman hated it. He was adamantly against him going out there and apologizing. He told everybody, basically, fuck you. He left the building, and that was the end of that. They talk about life on the road and the extreme nature of ECW and how much of a toll it took on Sandman. He talked about all of his injuries, all the broken bones, the broken neck, needing both of his shoulders replaced. He had an operation once on his knee. And then they show him, he came to the ECW show that night on crutches. And Lori says she got a call one day that Sandman had such a bad concussion that he couldn't remember anything. And she thought that they were playing a rib on her. And they're like, no, we're serious. He can't remember anything. And she says that was in the early days of his career. And there were how many times after that he probably got dinged in the head? And I mean, who knows? All those ECW guys. You know how many fucking concussions they probably suffered and didn't even know it? Scary. Scary to think about. So Sandman said he never took pills, but the pain just got to be too much, so he took a couple, which led to a couple more, and then more, and then more. Then you need Xanax to sleep. You need cocaine to get yourself back up. His daughter said that she knows what was in his fanny pack. She's not stupid. His son just knew that it was pain medication and that his dad needed it for his back and he needed to take it in order to keep working. So the kids saw this. They saw all of this going on. Gordon used to joke that if you could pass a piss test, you couldn't work for ECW. Yeah, funny. Sandman says they had 3 doctors they would see in Philly, and every month he would get 270 oxy pills, 300 somas, and 300 Percocets. And his daughter knew what the pills were. She knew what the bag of Coke was. It's pretty sad. RVD told a story in the episode one day he got mushrooms from someone, and he was really looking forward to taking these mushrooms after the show. And he has his match, and he goes back to the locker room. He checks his locker. There's no mushrooms. The Sandman ate the entire bag. Fonzie says that Sandman should be dead right now. Yeah, I'd say so. He and Raven tell a story about stopping in a bathroom once while they were traveling on the road and shooting themselves up with drugs. And Sandman decides that, because I guess Raven was taking the drugs. Sandman wants to try it. This is his first time. And he's going to take the same amount that Raven is taking. And Raven warns him. He goes, look, dude, don't do it. Don't take that much. And Sandman is like, whatever. I've done drugs before. What's the big deal? So he does it. They get back in the car. They start driving. And Sandman starts to have trouble breathing. And Raven looks and says, oh, his lips are turning blue. He says, holy shit, he's overdosing. He says this as he's laughing. So Sandman gets taken by ambulance to the hospital. They give him a shot of adrenaline. He wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning, rips the IVs out of his arms, and leaves, and then crashes at a hotel somewhere. He said he loved the feeling of the drug, whatever drug it was, but he knew he can never do it again. So now they start talking about the dying days of ECW, and Sandman gets the call from WCW. He says that he's making 5 times as much as he did in ECW if he takes the deal to go there. So, of course, he went. And that's when they called him Hack, right? He was hardcore Hack. He wanted to get bigger because everybody in WCW at that time, it was the land of the giants. You had your Hulk Hogan's and your Scott Steiners, Lex Luger, Buff Bagwell, all these people with these physiques and all of these physically bigger people. And so he starts to take steroids and he starts to take growth hormone. He says he only did it because, again, WCW was the land of the giants and he felt like he had to. And RVD laughs. He says Sandman got jacked for the first time in his career. And they showed footage of him coming down the aisle. This was after he was on the gas. And my God, he just looks like a totally different person. Like, holy shit. Unfortunately, the roids had another effect on his personality. And it made him very abusive towards his wife, physically and emotionally. And his wife says that she had her hair pulled. He put a pillow over her face once. We got a story of Sandman. They were, I guess, at the dinner table one night. I think they may have had guests. And he poured a beer on his wife's head. I guess because he thought it was funny, or maybe he was annoyed with her. He pours a beer over her head. And Fonzie's like, oh, that never would have happened if he wasn't on the gas. So she gets up and she gets revenge. She goes and grabs $10,000 worth of drugs, worth of steroids that are in the house, and pours them down the drain. And Sandman here, he's very reflective. He admits he put her through hell. And if he had his shit together, he thinks they would probably still be together. She says that she stayed in the marriage for too long, but she just couldn't live like that anymore. And Sandman, again, he says, look, it was all my fault. She was an angel. It's all my fault. So ECW closes in 2001, and WWE buys the bones. Sandman now is going to get his chance in WWE. And Raven talks about how it was very watered down, society had changed. The best part of WWE's version of ECW was the day they shut it down. Under any other name, it would have been maybe passable. It was very much, I would say it was very much like an early version of NXT. Under those ECW initials, it was a watered down shell of what it once was. Now, it did introduce the audience to CM Punk, who would have absolutely been a part of the original ECW had it lived on for a few more years, and Punk would have thrived there. I mean, he would have become Paul Heyman's top guy, guaranteed. Guaranteed. He would have been the number one guy in that company. So it gave us CM Punk introduced to the WWE audience. It gave us both one-night stand shows. Those were a lot of fun. But from the moment they relaunched as a brand, it was a fail. Although it did give us the Zombie. You know the Zombie, played by the late Tim Arson. I have a soft spot for the ECW Zombie. Syfy Network wanted there to be a supernatural element on the show. For those who don't remember, they relaunched ECW on the Syfy channel because that's the deal they got. So, because of course, when you think of ECW, you think of science fiction. So they want some supernatural element on the show. And their answer to that was to have a zombie and then have him caned into oblivion by the Sandman. And actually, I should correct myself. The original plan was for a Martian. They were going to have a Martian on the show. So it wasn't going to be a zombie, it was going to be a Martian. And instead of me telling the story, I'm going to let the zombie himself tell the story, because I had the chance to interview Tim Arson on Sound Off episode 129. This was way back in 2010. He was the very first interview that I ever did on this show. He gave me his time. He was very cool, and I always appreciated that. Here's how the zombie came about, along with a very Sandman story about one night that the two of them spent together in Puerto Rico.
As the story goes, Syfy Network wanted WWE to incorporate some science fiction elements into the program. Now, I've heard you kind of tell the story before, but I want you to tell it again for those who haven't heard it, because it's a great one. Explain how it came to pass that you ended up working the show that night against Sandman as the zombie, and the role that Paul Heyman played in making that happen.
Well, Tommy Dreamer was the road agent at that time. He was the main guy. And so he called me in to come to the tryout on that Monday where I wrestled Stryker. So on the Tuesday, I show up at SmackDown, and everybody worked out pretty much for the whole day up until like 5:30, around 6 o'clock. Now, don't forget that they're taping the first episode of ECW on a SmackDown taping. So that would be first at 7 o'clock, and then they would have SmackDown taping starting at 8 o'clock. So the SmackDown taping started at 8 o'clock. So everybody else got dressed, went back to get dressed, and then just pretty much got ready to go out and watch the show. And then they hung around backstage. I was still in my workout gear, and I was looking around, and I knew the thing with ECW was starting, and I wanted to do something. I was slated to go back to Puerto Rico the next day, and I didn't want to just get changed. I wanted to be a part of this. It was the first episode of ECW on Syfy, and so many of my heroes, Shane Douglas, just incredible. I mean, a lot of people might laugh at those guys now, but I tell you, at a time, man, they were my idols. My ECW was my rejuvenation in wrestling. When my brother introduced me to ECW when it was on public access here in New York back in, I guess, 97, 98, something like that. But in any case, so I wanted to be on there. I wanted to be with these guys. Long story short, I'm in my workout. It's already a long story. I'm in my workout gear, and I go to Vito. I go, "Hey, bro," and he's always been like a big brother to me. Looks like it was 6:30 at that time. They were 45 minutes from showtime. 7:15 they were starting. What should I do? Should I go get changed? Should I be like these other guys? He's like, "No, you keep your mouth fucking shut. You see this crate right here? You sit right there." And this is right in the back, about 100 feet behind the curtain, but in the main walkway where everybody's walking back and forth from catering to the offices to everything. So you're fully noticeable. They had a Martian that they were going to use, and apparently he disappeared. So Tommy Dreamer and Paul Heyman were about 50 feet from me, and I heard Paul going, "Where's the Martian? Where's the Martian?" And Tommy's like, I don't know. And then Paul was like, "I don't know about a Martian." He's like, "I don't know." He's like, it's ECW. I don't know about a Martian. We need a zombie. Who the fuck can we get to play a zombie, though? Tommy Dreamer, out of the corner of his eye, he saw me. And I guess I saved the day for him because he was like, Tim Arson? And I don't think that he didn't have any intention of using me at all. But I was there. I took Vito's advice. I sat there in my workout gear, and he said, "Tim Arson?" And I was like, yes. And I ran over, and Paul Heyman was like, "Show me your best zombie, kid." And I went, "Ugh." He's like, "What the fuck is that?" He's like, "Zombies like brains." He's like, "Scream out brains." And so then I did the brains. And he's like, all right. He's like, you got it. He's like, you got. And then he goes to Tommy. He goes, is this guy good? And Tommy goes, he was trained by John. He's like, get in the chair for makeup. And as God is my witness, they took my jeans that I wore to the show because they didn't have any jeans there, and they needed jeans. And they ripped my jeans up. They cut them up. They went outside. They got real cups of dirt from outside of the Sovereign Center, Sovereign Bank Arena, at the time in Trenton, New Jersey. They came in. They had a lumberjack shirt for me. They filled up the pockets with this real live dirt, and they sent somebody out to Gap to buy me another pair of jeans. And then Fit Finley came. He was the road agent for the match. I was working Sandman, who me and Hacker are really good friends because of Puerto Rico again. Because the previous summer it was right before he got signed. He was down in Puerto Rico and he was working for Carlos for 2 weeks. He was in the best shape of his life, and anyway, we hit it off because we were both Northeast boys, and we hung out. I've never drinking so much in my life. That's for another show. He kept me out till 9:30 in the morning one day. Yeah, that's right, 9:30 in the morning. We started at 5 at night the night before, out till 9:30 in the morning the next day. So anyway, Sandman comes over. He's like, all right, kid, I'm just going to come in. We're going to do this, and that. And that was fine. Then Fit Finley came over. He got me. He's like, all right, now it's time for final approval. And so I had to follow him, and he took me to Vince. And Vince was on the phone with two beautiful women in a little side office. And he goes, Vince, this is the zombie. He goes, go ahead, kid, show him the zombie. And I went, brains! And he goes, that's fucking brilliant.
Awesome.
And then he went right back to his phone call, and he was like, oh, great. So if he thought it was brilliant or not, I don't know. But anyway, Paul London and Spanky popped for a huge. And a couple of other guys did, too. I mean, it was showtime, and I went out and did my thing. And ever since, I mean, it's just been an unbelievable wave of popularity and people that have wanted to book me.
After the end of ECW, for good this time, Sandman is out of a job. His career is basically over. And his daughter gets a phone call one day at work that her dad has been arrested. So her and her brother, they drive to New York. They're trying to find a lawyer. And yeah, the producer asks him what happened. Sandman says 30 Long Island iced teas. That's what happened. And it led to a fight with the owner of the bar and a bottle hitting him in the head. So the kids had to run around to ATMs all over the city to get $10,000 to bail out their father. And they were able to get him out at 3 o'clock in the morning. And Kelly just completely bitched out her father and said that, no kid should have to do that. She was at her wit's end. I don't blame her. And Sandman admits he's had personal destruction in his life, and it really hits him now that he's a lot older. His son says that even through all the bad, his dad still put in the hard work. He's a self-made man. He got to live his dream. Sandman says his legacy is the first person to do a lot of things in wrestling, like bleeding before his match and smoking on his way to the ring and entering through the crowd. It's quite a legacy there, I will say. Bleeding before the match and smoking on his way to the ring. And drinking. Don't forget the drinking. That will be the Sandman's legacy. So let's take a look at the official Dark Side of the Ring checklist here. Drugs? Check. Alcohol? Check. Domestic violence? You bet. Man putting his family and his kids through hell? Check. The only thing missing was an eyeball story. Sandman sounds a lot better than he did a while back. He took accountability here for a lot of his poor life decisions. He seems to recognize the harm that he did to himself and to his family. His kids seem to be well adjusted. They seem to be doing well. His daughter reminds me a lot of him. And most importantly, he is still alive to see his grandkids and to tell all of these stories. So many of his ECW colleagues are no longer with us. So it's good that he is.